Good morning, everyone. This is the first episode, so to say, of the In Conversation With that we are going to have here at SSBU. That is when we have distinguished visiting scholars at our university. We will take the occasion to interview them. Today we have with us Professor Gustaaf Houtman. He has been a professor of anthropology at SOAS and a research fellow. And since 2014, he's a professor of anthropology at the University of Mandalay. He's also editor of the journal Anthropology Today. So this is not meant to be really an interview from me to him. It's meant to be almost an informal conversation. And members of the audience are also welcome to ask questions. Let me begin by asking Professor Houtman what brought him to SSBU and Burma at this time. What is his current work in Burma, in Mandalay?
Yes, thank you for the invitation, first of all. I came to Burma this time. There are other times I've been, but this time in order to be part of what seems to be a new beginning for Burma. So I've been coming since 2015, twice a year, and I teach on a voluntary basis at Mandalay University, anthropology. And so now I can see a little bit how the education system works, and I'm part of the everyday life, which for a long time I haven't been, because my fieldwork was in 1982, 83. So that was in Masalake. That's a long time ago. And things have changed a lot. So what I now find is there is a lot, apparently also less novitiations, less monks getting ordained. And I find that senior monks complain, and they say there's a difficulty of succession, there's a difficulty of village monks being able, taking up office in villages, because most of them would like to be in learned centers and in central places like towns and cities. So Buddhism seems to be undergoing a lot of change, but some of the changes that I've noticed since I've come here are the Parahita idea, which is very powerful, like this particular university. And so what I've seen since I've come are major changes, many of which are very good. Of course, whenever you have the idea of democracy, it is a very difficult process, and people have to adjust that there are other people with other identities who may not be Buddhist, who may not be Burman, and who also have their own ideas about what the country might look like, and they want to contribute. So it's a difficult time for everybody, at the same time as being a positive time. It's like two tastes. It's not quite clear which one will be the overarching taste. But I hope that with all the Parahita going on, like universities like this, schools for poor children run by monks, that this will help poor people also in Myanmar getting an opportunity for an education. Because otherwise, of course, in the West, of course, we have problems of our own with education that is too expensive. Now, as to what I'm doing at the moment in Mandalay, I'm doing research on the Bedesya. Now, in Shan State, you don't have a Bedesya, but you have, of course, senior people in a village who will do a marriage, a wedding, and who will do a novitiation, and so forth. But a Bedesya is a phenomenon that's particular to Mandalay and sort of area around Mandalay, so Magwe, Pagan, but also you don't find it in Rangoon, but you find it also in Tenasserim. But there are differences between all these different kinds of Bede in the different areas. And so what I'm doing is I'm at the moment writing a book about how Bedesya fits in with Buddhism, and how Bedesya are responsible, or see themselves as responsible, for performing rites of passage. And rites of passage are what we do as an individual. We go through life, we are born, and then we become an adult, and every phase of our life deserves some kind of ritual celebration. And so the Bedesya has the Loki Mingala Senaba. So in Mandalay, there are probably about well over 200 Bedesya, some of whom are very rich, it may be said, because they're very good at charging good prices for their Bede. But many of them are struggling. Many of them are very old and very senior and experienced. And many of them are very young, like some are 17 or 18. And there's a difference in style between these kind of Bedesyas. And Bede is changing in Myanmar, and it's quite an interesting topic. The reason why I'm so interested in this is because I believe that Buddhism has a very particular attitude or particular perspective on a person's life. And largely, what it doesn't do is it does not do what the Brahmins do, or the Hindus do. Samskara, the idea of lots of rituals which are necessary for each phase of life, for each change, for every change of location, change of purpose, you always need a ritual. In Buddhism, these rituals aren't really emphasized too much. So the idea is that an individual does not need these rituals from the point of view of a monk. And certainly, so these rituals for lay people are not necessarily emphasized. So what I would like to come up with is a way of thinking about Buddhism as a fairly free-floating system that doesn't necessarily entangle itself with everything in the lay world. So that way, Buddhism can continue the way it does. Monks can continue to learn and bring forth Buddhism without taking lay influence to an extreme, who may not have any education, who may not have the right ideas. So by keeping these rites of passage separate from the monkhood, because the monks do not perform this, it maintains Buddhism as a system that doesn't have to integrate with music, with dance, with the joy of a layperson. Now, in Christianity, of course, a person, when you're born, in principle, all rituals are taking place in the same church that you're a member of. If you're a member of a church, I'm not, and I think many people are not nowadays, but in the past. So that meant that you would always be, from cradle to grave, you would be initiated by the same person in the same church. And that's very different in Myanmar. So people have a freedom here that we don't have in monotheistic religions. And I would like to emphasize that freedom that people have in that book, ideally.
If I may, I would like to go back a little bit and see how you develop your interest in anthropology and in Buddhism, both. I read in your website that as a child or as a young man, you attended different schools in different countries, including Iran, the Netherlands, and even Argentina. Is that right? Do you think that cosmopolitan exposure influenced your interest in anthropology?
For those of you who don't know anthropology, anthropology is the study of mankind, or humankind rather. Nowadays, mankind is the wrong word because we're not talking about a male world, obviously. The idea of anthropology is, at some point in time, there was a discovery that human beings had a sense of universality across the globe, and that happened with travel. But people live differently in different places. Now, we could say that our lives are always the best. The way we live is the only way. And that's the tendency for most people, because if they don't travel, they don't see anything. They're used to what they're used to. They want to eat what they eat. They want to see the people they want to see. They don't want to see things they don't want to see. And so they always stay among their own kind. Now, with colonialism, and anthropology developed on the back of colonialism, with colonialism there was an enormous amount of travel by so many people all over the place. In most cases, the travel was to govern, or missionaries to missionize. And in these cases, of course, the idea was that you control, you apply power in different places and so forth. But at the same time, in order to be able to govern, you need to understand the people that you govern. You can't just govern people you don't understand. You can't do that. Then it's just a recipe for violence, repression, domination. So ultimately what happened over time is that anthropology developed since the 1840s. And my institute that I work for was set up in 1843. Before the universities had anthropology. It was like a well-to-do man, usually, who collected things from all over the world and started to speculate about how human beings were the same all over or had differences, as the case may be. And this happened in the wake of a big exhibition called the World Exhibition at Crystal Palace in London. There was a world exhibition where they had invited peoples from all over the world to represent themselves at that exhibition. And that made people reflect, how can this unity of human beings, the unity, how can all this diversity be at the same time a form of unity? And what is a human being? What are the needs of a human being? What are the thoughts? What are the developments, the evolutionary developments? So we have physical anthropology, which looks at the human being as a physical being. Over time, how did the human being come to be across all the different species? But at the same time, how do human beings organize their lives? What religions do they profess? How do they think? How do they organize family life? How do they organize their livelihoods? And so these kind of questions became interesting for anthropologists. And then we had a range of ideas about, to answer your question, yes, travel is the way to enter into anthropology. Because I was put in a Spanish-speaking school at the age of 9, and I didn't speak a word of Spanish, and I had to cope, and I had to learn Spanish as I went along. So I went to 7 different primary schools out of 6 years. So a lot of different changes. Every time I had to reestablish myself. And so this idea of dealing with diversity is a specialty of anthropology. And some people criticize anthropology and say, well, it's a colonial discipline, you know, it just basically supports colonialism. I don't think that's quite true. There are times when anthropology, when government and when people with authority want to use anthropology to dominate. That does happen. But nowadays, a lot of anthropologists, or most anthropologists I would say, do not want to enter into that kind of service. And there is now an ethics statement that we have which says you never shop or inform on the people among whom you work, your loyalties with them. So the idea is that you live amongst a people in the world, somewhere in the world, whether it's in the jungle of the Amazon, or maybe headhunters in Borneo, or maybe in Latin America somewhere, or wherever. And you spend a year living like the people there do. So you learn the language, you eat like they do, you live like they do, for at least a year. And it's called fieldwork. And the method we deploy is participant observation. So we're not like lab scientists, you know, just observing. We're actually participating in the life. And that way learning about the cultural sensibilities, the way that people organize themselves, and then develop these ideas into a theoretical perspective about that society. So we now have Anthropology of Buddhism, which is a very particular kind of anthropology, and I think you will be interested in it because it develops from the 1960s, 70s. So the earliest monograph is Melford Spiro on Buddhism in Society, and he went as an American, Jewish person. He had studied in Israel, kibbutz, and he had a question, a particular question. He wanted to know whether Buddhism was integrally different from other religions. So he came to Burma and he wrote this book, 2 books, one on supernaturalism, on Nabwe, Taunggyi, yeah, and he wrote endlessly about nuts and so forth, and the other one is about Buddhism. And he asked the question, he said, are Buddhism and spirit cults different religions, or are they the same? Are they one religion, or are they different ones? And of course, in Myanmar, everybody says, spirit cults, don't deal with them, it's low, don't do it. Because it's not good for you. It's not good for the country. Our image is destroyed if you talk about Taunggyi. It's all about worldly things. Lokia Kesa. So that idea took hold that when foreigners came to do anthropology here in Masalake, the idea was also, don't do these things, just do good things. Wipatana sura kaun era lela wa era ne choya tamyona ne miya malone. So this idea developed but Spiro was before Masalake, but Masalake intervened. He wanted to come back, but he wasn't allowed by Ne Win. So the idea was that he just wrote his 2 books at the time on spirit cults and on Buddhism. Now, these books stand as the earliest monograph on Buddhism, and they are worthy of study because it's a very different approach from what you're normally as monks are used to, because we are dealing with society and Buddhism. And it's a question in Myanmar that people don't ask often. How do monks deal with lay people? The monks, they deal with Tipitaka and with, learned pariya kaungan cheye pongji le tige aumyame no. But in this case, there are many texts that they're not necessarily true. We can't say that they are perceptions of Buddhism in Myanmar at a particular time, in a particular village. And you can learn from it because it's historical, it observes what goes on day to day, and it brings a particular theoretical thinking about what does Buddhism do in a different way from other societies who have you can do a comparison. And what Spiro said, and this I come back to what I said earlier about rites of passage, he said, it's peculiar. Why don't monks do rites of passage? Shimbyura sura bapilo pongji mlobule. Loki mingala senaba bapilo pongji mlobule. He didn't understand it. Why? Because the background of most foreigners is monotheism. And in monotheism, we have the idea that there's one creator God, and He created everything. So we go to church, and we get a service, and that's where we do all our initiations. So the Christian Pongji, Kriyan Pongji, does all the karna, alone. But here we have Pongji. The Pongji say, no, not that mingala, malone, dan jinonim sign. So this idea you have in Myanmar, and that Spiro said, I don't know why that is. He said, I can only move on. I have no answer. So what I've tried to do in my talk earlier yesterday is to find out an answer why in Buddhism these monks do not do these things. And I think I've come to a kind of an explanation, an attempt at explanation, but there must be other ways of explaining it too.
Thank you very much. I have a question. Actually, I have many questions. One is that, of course, from the Western point of view, the anthropology is a method of research, so to say, but it is also an intervention on the place. So how would you explain this resistance that you meet from the monks? I mean, does it make any sense for them to say what they say about the study of Nat, cults, and so on?
It's a very good question, because I went to Taunggyi, and when you go to Taunggyi as a human, you end up being pinched. It's a very sexualized event. It's an event where the lowest of the low of emotions come up, passions come up, and then you end up offering whiskey to one of the to one of the nuts. Which, of course, for a Pongji, this is no place to go. So Spiro, interestingly, I mean, it's what you're saying is interesting, because you're saying if anthropologists publish about these things, are they possibly creating a possibility for a misperception of Buddhism, which monks are not happy with, or feel is inappropriate, and so forth. And I think that's true, but at the same time, most anthropologists who are following the method that they initiate, they're not making universal statements. No paramata thissa about anything. There is only tamoti thissa. There's only lokia tabo. So we are not making a statement that Buddhism is like that. No. But what we are seeing is we are seeing people living, and most of the time people say things, but they think something else. And then they may be doing something else. So there may be three ways in which people are. One person could have three different aspects to their life. So Spiro said, oh, so many people say, the nuts, don't bother with them, it's not worth it. Tanga go dwain puzo yin, no? Edi kama kudo ya ne bi le, edi kama na le mala do bu. Sai ma pu ne. Tanga shi yin sai ma pu ne. Da me tro le na go dwa de le. Phonji ma lo lau. It's not enough to have monks. We also need the nuts. So he describes the conflict, and he shows how some people say, don't go to the nuts. They're not worth it. It's not. But then he goes to their home and has lunch with them, and they only swear. In the Miboga, in their kitchen, they have their only against fire and so forth. Min Mahagiri. So people say things, but what they're thinking and what they're doing is something else. So in Buddhism, often when there's preaching, of course, we need to pay attention to the good things, the good mind, the good message, and so forth. But what people do in reality also exists. And so we can't just have an ideal description of what human beings do, what they would like to do only. Hitler said he wanted to do good for the world, but he didn't do much good. So what people do is equally important. And so in that sense, to have a full description of Buddhism as a living system, it's good to have observations, snapshots in time. So for example, if you look at James Scott, the Burman, Edisa Orema o Taunggyi Shisek Nakunima, Bodhabala sort of Belu Tweetle, Edisa Orema Pare. Edon Jarabo, Mobula. Ano Manaro Matemu. So the idea is, if we have lots of books by people who have observed what's going on, it enriches our understanding, and for future generations of Buddhism as a living system. And so that's what I would say is a positive thing.
Thank you so much. May I go back to the first question? Maybe it's a little bit methodological, but I think it's good for students and teachers here to listen from you. What would be your definition? I mean, what makes anthropology different? What does an anthropologist do? And what is the difference between the anthropology of Buddhism and the philosophy of Buddhism, or the sociology of Buddhism, or simply history of Buddhism, or journalism on Buddhism? What's really the difference? What is anthropology about?
Maybe we could put it this way. Every time has its own observations, and there are genres of observation. If you go back to the year 1500, who was in Myanmar? Marco Polo. What did he say? Oh, shui myare, shui imita myare, the rot tape yedele, wow. Tu Bodhabala jam nenama namalelu, tu shui myare. So what he said was, there's just so much gold, it's so amazing. And they do that all for Buddhism. Wow, Buddhism must be very special. So Marco Polo, his knowledge at the time was very limited, had no knowledge, so he could only observe. But to have his observations, is it useful? Yes, otherwise we wouldn't know. So then we had missionaries. We are coming here to bring you the light. Judson, we are coming to convert you. Anatta sodabale. Kimya phya shi da hala, anatta ba le. Kimya pyo zamba. So they didn't convert. They couldn't convert any Burman Buddhist. Judson had to go, flee to the hills. The Kenyan Nataune, Kachin Nataune. They don't listen. So he was very tired and he was very upset. You should read his letters. He was sweating, he was ill, he was upset. And he just couldn't make any headway. So this is interesting, but missionaries had their own genre of writing. They would say, you know, these Buddhists, they have all these statues. They are idol worshippers. So that they would write back to their head office about how unchristian the people were that he observed. Now, are their descriptions just? Are they correct? Probably no. Are they interesting? Probably yes. Are they worthwhile to keep as an observation from one people about another? Yes. Put it in context. It's not absolute truth. It's their observation from their point of view. That's what they thought. So if we then move from traveler and adventurer, Marco Polo, to missionary, Judson, and then we move to colonial civil servant. Colonial civil servant has to ochode. So the idea, you remember Orwell shooting the elephant. Have you ever read this? It's very interesting. George Orwell was an officer in Myanmar, and he is a very famous writer in the West. He wrote many things, and people love him, especially now, because we have a secret state, and he's against the secret state, so he gives you all these interesting readings. So what he wrote is, he wrote an essay called Shooting the Elephant. Now, he was in a village, and he was responsible for the village. The villagers come to him, they say, di sin di ywa de ko la ne bi a long shou ne bi lu le de ne bi khmya ye ya shi so la zamba edi khama tu chaw la ba phit le tu be ro ma sin ma pit bu tu le ma ti bu edi khama tu la de. Then he writes about his observations. I am here, a colonial officer, but I'm so frightened of these Burmese because they're forcing me to do things that I don't want. I don't want to shoot an elephant. Yeah? And so he writes about his dilemma. And is that worth reading? Yes, it's worth reading. And so is it true? Maybe not always. But does it reflect the time in which people were observing Myanmar? Yes. As a colonial civil service officer, with authority from Myanmar, he had to be Luji, VIP. He had to do that. Even if he couldn't, he couldn't really, his mind wasn't there. He wanted to write, he wanted to write interesting stories. He wasn't interested in shooting and killing and maiming. That's not his work. So the dilemma of a colonial officer coming to Myanmar, it's a very interesting dilemma, and it needs to be understood. If you want to understand colonialism, then you need to read their perceptions. So, going from traveler, Marco Polo, missionary, Judson 1800s, maybe 1700s, 1600s onwards, missionaries. Civil service, 1823 onwards. What do we get next? We get Buddhists. Western Buddhists, like who do we have? We have Francis Story, Francis Story, and there are many others, of course. Now, they are so interested in Buddhism. They think the West is on the wrong path, right? We're at the end of colonialism a little bit. I mean, colonialism is being doubted. Is it a good project? Not really. It's not a great thing to do. So there were people who were born in the West and who felt that there was a lot more interesting things happening in the East than there was in the West. The West was dead. Christianity, nobody's interested in Christianity anymore, right? People weren't believing anymore. So they came to Myanmar and they said, wow, this is interesting. I'm going to learn about Buddhism. I'm going to read, and so forth and so forth. So they became monks. And they became interested more and more, and they became advocates. What did they write? They wrote ideal essays. Oh, like Buddhism is beautiful. They didn't talk about Taunggyi. No. No. Nibbana. Yeah, very Nibbanic. Yeah. So very ideal. So the embracers were very idealists, you know. And they brought Buddhism back to the West and so forth and so forth. Now, what did we then have? So we had embracers of Buddhism, converts. We also had, of course, the Pali Text Society, and we had serious scholars, often ex-civil servants who took an interest after they had been here for a long time. They started to read the books that the Burmese themselves wrote, because they knew the language. Missionaries and colonial servants, they knew the language. Yeah, travelers didn't. Embracers often didn't, converts, but these did. So the Pali Text Society then brought out all those translations, very useful translations. And that's when Buddhism became known, and even Queen Victoria thought Buddhism was a good system, was a moral system. So little by little, on the inside of the colonial project, people began to weaken, and they began to see the message. There was an example of Rear Admiral Shattock. Do you know about that? At the end of the British Navy, the British colonial period, the Navy withdrew from Southeast Asia, British Navy, in the 1950s. And what happened is the Rear Admiral Shattock, the chief of the fleet, he went to Myanmar to practice Mahasi, Pampeng. And he wrote 3 books about it. Yeah? Now, if we think back, what happened with King Mindon? With Mindon, the British came. What did he do? So he invited monks, and he listened to their preaching, and so he was interested in Bhavana, Mindon. He had an interest in this, and he supported Meking and a number of other, we have Poglain, Yodwemu Poglain. He also was deeply into Kayanupadana and all that sort of things. So during the time of Mindon, he was a king with only half a kingdom. Torokete no? Begin pitane, dabe the miele alo mo pai mule. Torokete. Edi kama the Vipadana level. Toro seven zara. So what we see is when people lose their status, they're empty. What do? Vipassana Thai come la come. So we have this idea that colonialism then was a project that was coming to an end. And then we had these texts that had been translated. So people like you and I, we could read about Buddhism before we knew any of the languages, whether it's Burmese or Pali. And that was very beneficial. So we could learn about Buddhism without having to bother to know these difficult languages. So Buddhism became a real established system as the result of scholars. Scholars, so is it useful to have Pali Text Society scholars? It's certainly. Is it useful to have people like embracers or converts to Buddhism in the 1900s, and they wrote like, is it good? Yes, it's good. It's interesting. It provides another perspective. So what then happens? We have in 1960s, 1950s, 60s, 70s, we have anthropologists. Now anthropologists do something a little bit different. Anthropologists, they are brought up in a society that no longer is in charge of the colonies. So we have no authority. So we can respect the society because we don't have to govern it like Orwell did. So we don't know the language. The local civil servants knew Burmese. But as anthropologists, we have to learn from scratch. So we begin and we read about Myanmar and we find lots of interesting sort of things about it. And then we decide to go. So what happened with that genre as anthropologists is to look at Buddhism in practice. How do people do things in everyday life? And that's what anthropology does. And that's a contribution that's worthwhile. It's not always very well carried out. There are many mistakes. You will find many mistakes. But if you can forgive them a little bit, the overall picture is of interest because it is an observation from an outsider. Can you imagine if somebody came from Mars and came to look at Myanmar? It would be interesting to see what they would say. You don't know. Yeah? So from that point of view, I think anthropology is one development in a range of developments, and we don't put scriptural learning primary. We put observation, participant observation primary. So in the Pali Text Society, you have Pariya. So in Pariya, we see a lot of ideal Buddhist ideas. So you read Winston King in 1956, 58, he wrote, I've read all these books from Pali Text Society. Wow, Buddhism is such a beautiful system. So interesting. Nibbana, so kaune. Yeah, he was a Christian, but he really liked it. Then he said, wow, but then when I landed in Myanmar and I went to Shwedagon, what did I see? I saw lights, Bodo, Weza. I had a cultural shock for which none of my readings of the Pali Text Society prepared me. Yeah, so he said a culture shock. So he said Buddhism in practice is very different from Buddhism in text. It's so different. So he wrote about what Buddhism is like in practice. So we need these observations, and because otherwise we mislead. If people only read what is in the Tipitaka and they come to Myanmar, it's not Myanmar. Myanmar loves the Tipitaka, but what is in the Tipitaka is not the same as Myanmar. For example, Bodhabada. Bodhabada era Tipitaka ma dai ma tong ja hu. Bodhabada so gukim ma tong ne wara. So Bodhabada is a Pali word, and we call it Buddhism. And there are allegations that it's because Judson put it in his first dictionary, because he wanted to make Buddhism the same as Islam and Christianity and his own religion, that he made everything Bada, so it would no longer be Tadana. So there are these studies that we can do, but I think overall anthropology is a useful contribution, even if we have to be skeptical of every time and every genre for its own reasons.
Thank you very much. I have another question now. So we discussed anthropology, the concept of anthropology. Now I'd like to discuss briefly, although we have touched on it, the concept of Theravada, or when we talk about Buddhism, or when we try to define what is Theravada Buddhism. I think the anthropologist has his own view on that, which is, as it has been said, very different from the textual scholar, such as, for instance, myself. So what would be the definition of Theravada from your perspective as an anthropologist?
Oof. Oof. Maybe it's a very conservative system that is very much takes its cue from the past. So it's repeating what was originally, historically said by the Buddha, and then repeating and repeating and repeating it by memorizing, not necessarily by creatively interpreting. Because in Myanmar, monks don't generally creatively interpret, because that's a no-no. You stick within the bounds of your tradition. And when we in the West, people say very funny things. They say, for example, there was a practitioner of Vipassana, and he said, "Oh, I've been meditating Vipassana under the Mahasi," and now he calls himself Arahat, Yahanda. He calls himself Yahanda. I said, "What? Can you do that?" No, you can't do that. But he does, and he doesn't understand Theravada, that you can't do that. So when foreigners come in, it's hard for them to fully understand how the system works. And they believe that they can quickly come in, take out the most precious achievements, go like that. So easy. Just have to go to the right Sayadaw, and then I went to Burma and I studied under this famous Sayadaw, and now I Thodapa. So this idea in Theravada is a no-no, isn't it? You can't make a claim. Even if your disciples make a claim, they may say, this Sayadaw, he's very special. He Tule Ariya Pilime. That may think. Don't say it too loudly. But of course we talk about Sun Lun as Yahanda, and we talk about, we have all these Arya epithets that we do employ, especially for monks in the past. It's easier in the past. In the present it's more difficult. Because this is a little bit difficult, because government doesn't like this idea either, especially in Masalakhe. But now maybe with democracy, maybe you could become a Thodapan without too much consequence. But you shouldn't, you shouldn't announce it too openly. So Theravada to me is a system of learning that sets as its primary objective ordination. Ordination within a tradition. You do not learn without ordination properly. You cannot learn properly because you need the Winnie Theka, no? And then you must have a good siya. If you just have not good siyas, then you fall. And then the idea of pariya. Without pariya, there cannot be any padipa. So that's the system, and there can't be any padiveda. So this idea is that pariya is really the main historical force that drives Buddhism along with ordination. And when these are broken, then Buddhism is lost, is kind of at a loss. So to me, Theravada is a little bit like that.
Thank you very much. Now that we were discussing meditation, you are a scholar of meditation movements in colonial and post-colonial times, even in contemporary Burma, Myanmar. I would like to ask you, as a scholar of pre-modern Burma, what do we know about meditation before the arrival of the British? Do we know anything? Was it very different from contemporary meditation movements that have been so successful even in the West nowadays?
That's a really difficult question, because obviously we don't know that much about the very early days. If you had anthropologists from the year 1, you could have observations of actually what was going on in a society. So these observations would have been helpful. You know, there's so many meditation centers, they do this and that and that and that. That's useful if you had that for the year 1700 and 1600. But we don't have them. What we do have is a lot of books, a lot of writings. And there are a lot of writings that are about meditation. And they date like throughout history. But the question is, are they scholastic books or were they practitioner books? And sometimes it's difficult to distinguish. Like, for example, for the Bethé, I mean, I'm just getting off the tangent here for a moment. There's a book about Bethé by Aung Chain. It's 3 volumes, Loki Mingala Senaba, and how to become a Bethé Siya. And that book, I went to interview a very renowned Bethé Siya of about 92 years old. And he was on oxygen, but he told me, he said, this book is not very good. And you know why? He was just collecting everything and he was writing it down. He was himself not a Bethesya. So he didn't have that experience. So we have lots of scripts, lots of books, writings and so forth on meditation. But did they actually meditate, or was it a scholastic exercise? And that's a very difficult thing. So I'm not a historian, so I haven't done all that historical work. And some people say that we can go back to the 1700s for evidence of real meditation methods that were advocated. But mostly it was a monastic tradition. So as a lay tradition, probably it doesn't date more than, if you include the Thilaye, maybe 1840s. Let's say Yodwing Upurlaing had a clear idea of what Vipassana was. Although he had a very peculiar idea, he had an interesting idea, and he wrote about it. So that was dates from the 1840s. So probably we can go back to maybe these 1700s for some of these connections to traditions that were alive. But it's very hard to now make out where they were. We would have to read a lot of Pesa and a lot of works and have a lot of knowledge that I don't have to interpret it.
Thank you very much. May I ask, what are the current trends in the anthropology of Buddhism in Myanmar and Southeast Asia, apart from, for instance, your work? Other general trends that you might observe in the field?
Yeah, trends. It's now so big a subject, and there's so many people working on it. It's much less easy to survey. In the past, from the 50s, we only had like a handful of books. Now we have so many books coming out and articles. So there are all kinds of Theravada Buddhism. We've got the Shan Buddhism. We've got people writing books about Shan Buddhism, articles, and it's like a microcosm. It has its own history. It has its own understandings, and so it's a little bit more difficult to characterize it as going one way. But within the broad anthropological field, we tend to go through phases. So when we have a theory, the theory changes with the time. So when computers arose, suddenly we were interested in a way of interpreting that was incompatible with computers. We talked about symbols. We talked about society as language. Whereas before that, we talked about society as a body in functionalism. And then we went to structuralism. And before that, we had evolutionary theory. So Fraser and Tyler. What they try to do is to put the whole world in one theory, and then they go from animism to structured religion as an evolutionary development. That was very daring, and everybody disapproved of it afterwards. So every time we have a theory, we end up criticizing it. So now we are beyond structuralism, and we have had modernism and postmodernism now, and now we're in limbo with our interpretation, and we're trying to find a way in which we can write that is true to what we see. But because we see things differently all the time, because now we think differently. With computers now, we represent all our texts, and we can search by keyword, and we think differently. We're no longer the same people. So our theories change. So we become interested in different things. So it used to be that we were interested in the village. How does the village work? How do the monks in the village live? What do they do? Now, after 10 years, that's very boring. Why? There are monks in the city too, right? So anthropologists used to look at small communities. That's what they like, little communities. But then they went for the nation state. That was a big jump with Tambaya and so forth, the nation state. How is Buddhism there? So we moved from the village to the nation state. And then we moved to biographies. So what is a Theropati? How does a Theropati establishes what Buddhism is? So we went from the village, small, to the nation state. And then we went to small biography. And then we look at historical traditions of Buddhism, how they change and how they alter. And then we look at unorthodox Buddhism. How do movements arise that people say, oh, that's not good, that's wrong, shouldn't be. Like, for example, ordaining in blue, putting a blue thinga, or wearing a hat like on the border. There are monks who have little crowns that they carry on their head in the border area. So anthropologists become interested in unusual. But that's dangerous too, because if you write about unusual things and people think that that's Buddhism, then you find that you alienate the majority of the monks, because they see this as peripheral and marginal, and possibly against the Vinaya. So we have problems as anthropologists that we may end up in trouble by experimenting so much. But then again, nobody governs us.
Thank you. Now I would like to turn the tables. So most of the members of the audience are Buddhists and actually ordained monks. Is it possible to have a Buddhist, not an anthropology of Buddhism, but real Buddhist anthropology that is doing research, anthropological research, taking Buddhism as the methodological framework instead of, for instance, taking structuralism and many other methodologies that are ideologically charged, although they pretend to be neutral.
I think potentially it's possible, but you'd have to be very, how would you say it? You would have to use the techniques objectively and be critical where you need to be critical. So you have to retain the independence of mind. So if you, for example, you may be a pupil of a Sayadaw, and Sayadaw doesn't like you to ask questions of a particular kind. And then he says, oh, because, of course, you're already a pupil of the Sayadaw. And if you write a book, Sayadaw is implicated. That's the problem. So if you go and start having a Buddhist anthropology, can you maintain the independence of the questioning? And can you keep the comparative framework alive in the same manner? And if you can, I think you can have a Buddhist anthropology, potentially. Like you can have Buddhist economics.
Great. So now I would like to ask if anyone has questions to ask before I continue. I think, yes.
Monks and two lady students to take this approach and to look at what we see and to record manuscripts, how they change over time. I just wondered how you think, what you think of that approach, if you have an opinion, because I'm trying to train monks to be anthropologists, so I'm quite interested in, but from the point of view of material culture. That is in the title of my contract here, if you like, to actually take that approach. I just wonder if you have any comments on that.
It sounds reasonable. You can't begin with a theoretical approach if there are language barriers, there are cultural barriers. You've got to begin with very basic things you can see. So I think it's the same principle everywhere with education. You've got to get the visual stuff, and so people can see, and then you move on, and little by little. If you have time enough, then you can go into theoretical issues, but generally you begin with more ethnographic points, like what is the difference between that, and how does that work, and so sounds perfectly reasonable to me in this context to teach that kind of material.
Here on Buddhist sociology, and so I would like to make it clear the process of the difference of the anthropological approach and the sociological approach. As I have learned that sociology have macro and micro approaches. So in terms of micro, whether the sociological approach and anthropological approach are the same or different? Thank you.
That's a very, very difficult question. Micro and macro. Well, generally, the way we think as anthropologists, we have a perception of sociology. Sociology both informs anthropology through the early Durkheim, Weber, and all the early scholars. So we base our anthropology on sociological theory. We share that common ground. But insofar as the macro is concerned, it's true that sociology historically looked at usually what happens within nation states or at the level of the nation state and larger communities. Whereas anthropology historically looked for the smaller communities as their mainstay of research. So you would live in a village or a little community. But this has changed over time, because now anthropologists tend to look at the whole nation and maybe even larger multi-site field work and large issues. And sociology has perhaps also maybe gone a little bit sometimes towards the micro at times. But maybe the methodology is a little bit different in the sense that in sociology you use surveys more often, questionnaires and surveys. You rely a little bit more on government statistics and things like that, which in anthropology we tend to sort of slightly avoid. Not always, but we don't make it our mainstay for our analysis. because these are, we rely on data we gather ourselves most of the time, in that sense. So there's a little bit of a difference, but there's a lot of overlap. And sometimes it's not quite clear nowadays. You may have an anthropologist in a sociology department, and you may have a sociologist in an anthropology department. And the department that I was at is called the Department of Anthropology and Sociology. So it's kind of like, so there's a lot of overlap, I think. It's not so easy to make a clear divide between the two. What do you think about it?
Have no clear idea. Yeah. And in terms of quantitative and qualitative research, I think the sociology maybe more on the quantitative,
yes.
Qualitative,
yeah,
and the anthropology
more
quantitative.
Amazing, like you know about Myanmar a lot, even more than us maybe. I have never been to Taunggyi yet. Okay, my question is, okay, since you know about Buddhism in Myanmar, and may I know the difference between the Buddhist perspective? I mean, what are the differences?
Myanmar ma miopla bodapa. Nanganja ma miopla mahodo. Era nanganja ga la de bodapa. So they are rootless. Foreign Buddhists have a problem with context because they don't have the context that you have. You have a context, you were brought up in a setting, you know exactly what the limits are, the boundaries, and whatever you do. But a foreigner coming in thinks, wow, this is Buddhism, I'm going to be free forever, great. And they do what they like. But they have no idea what the sensibilities are in the Burmese context. So in that sense, I think in Buddhism abroad participates in a lot of different kinds of Buddhism. So, you know, or today I like a little bit of Tibetan, a bit like shopping, you know, like if you go to a restaurant, oh, I like a little bit of Chinese today and a little bit of Indian curry today and whatever. So it's a little bit like that. The Westerners, they say, oh, this is spectacular, I'd love to do this, let's do it. But there's no cultural background that guides them. So in that sense, they don't have the sensibilities. But that makes them probably very interesting pupils for you. If you take on a Western pupil, they go all over the place. And they are full of curiosity and questions, which Burmese don't ask. Burmese, you know, they just do their Seba Dila, and then Shimpia. They will just do their recitations and everything. But these Westerners, they don't have a clue. So you can completely mold them if you want them that way. You can just guide them the way you want, because they have no background. So there's advantages and disadvantages to it. Because some of the Westerners become absolute dedicated followers of, for example, a meditation teacher. For example, Ubake. You have all these centers outside. Ubake, Siaji Ubake. They really believe in him. And they believe in Goenga. That's Guruji. So we have this element that makes Western Buddhism very, very different from Buddhism in Myanmar. Actually, completely different.
Can I ask one more question? Yeah. Okay, in this case, how would you suggest us, as a Burmese monk, as a Burmese nun, if we want to do the propagation in the West? How should we approach? I mean, to get their interest in Buddhism. I mean, in our way, in Burmese Buddhist way. Yeah.
I think probably universities are a good place. At a university, their students are always open. They always want to learn something new. And so they would love to come to somewhere where, for example, you may give a meditation session. A lot of them are interested in meditation. They don't necessarily see it as a technique that is Buddhist, but something that helps them pass their exams or calm them down, you know, their anxieties. Students have many anxieties because they're all indebted. They all have big debts. They have to pay a lot of fees for their studies. So, so you could just offer some counseling sessions, maybe, if people are in trouble and they have a problem. But it's very easy, because I see most of the monks who come, and nuns. I haven't known any nuns coming to England. So maybe you're the first one. Siale, Chwaba. Chwaba. So you could have quite an easy impact. The main problem is finding housing, finding a chaung. That's your difficulty. And also it's very cold most of the time in these countries, so you have to dress up quite a bit. And then there's maybe an element of loneliness, because you're here, di ma chuayin through long lujin. Di ma tingam mieneka through lujin. Da mio pala boda bala. Through kudo yadali. Da menang jama kudo miyao. Through kudo miyajimu. Elise ero sing sabo velo long la mediu. Mi apien bamalu mio la slume. Sunjueme. That's probably the best thing. So when as a community of Burmese, you're safe, you have shelter, you have food, but you can then go to universities and organize events. It's very easy. On internet, you just say, Thursday, 1 to 2, Siale, Kamatan, Tanap, Kamatan, Peme, Kamatan, Etam Peme. And then they come, because it's the students, they're interested in everything. Dhammasami used to teach meditation at SOAS, and it was always full, the room was full. It's quite, they're very hungry for spiritual ideas. It's not really a problem.
Thank you very much.
Good morning, professors. I want to know, as you anthropology, you study about human being. So I want to know, do you know about the original human being, or where is the first place? The first place. In Bible, I have to raise the Eden Park. Eden Park, where is Eden Park? In England or America? So, at the time, which kind of language do they speak? I want to know. How do you understand according to your anthropological approach?
If I remember rightly, wasn't it Byamabong Galare? Hola. Byamabong Lapido, di Kabama Polare. Lapido Nene Baba, mi osa sapido, through Koyare. Lapido Kileda Yare. Lapido Siboy Shayare. Lapido Tia Ubrile Lore, Bapile, the Komialule, Kileda Miarane. Lapido le me bien lore, Erigama. And listen, Siboy in a bien, the other G, Kileda Polare. Elupio in the Yonji Baretine. In anthropology, who is the earliest human being is very difficult, because they've now found that various species mixed in, so there are various species and subspecies, and there are lots of developments. And I'm not a physical anthropologist. I'm not physica. So that means that I don't know, because these theories are changing all the time. One day they find in Africa, they find the oldest skeleton. The next day they find in China the oldest skeleton. Then they find it in Europe again, and then they find it all over the place. So there are theories, and these theories over a period of about 40, 50 years, they shift. So now they find out that if you look at your DNA, every cell has DNA, they find out that you are part Neanderthal. You're not just human, you're also Neanderthal. So I've got some Neanderthal in me, because I did DNA analysis. So the questions are becoming very complex. The idea that there's a beginning, and Eden is of course a Christian idea, Eden. That's the beginning of Christianity, but we don't believe in creationism anymore. Creationism is the idea that the beginning of the world was a Christian beginning. And scientists have argued for centuries now about these Christians, because the Christians believe what they believe. They believe that the beginning is their beginning. But scientists think that the beginning is otherwise. So that's why they are arguing in America all the time. And Trump supports the creationists. Because he looks at Fox News. and probably Facebook too. So he's ill-informed. But I don't know the ins and outs of evolutionary anthropology because that's not something I studied. It's a very long-range question that I'm not very good at. Maybe next time. I'll look it up for you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Now I was student of anthropology and society. My question is, as monks who live in the temple are stomach of belly, the division of religion, they come to offer food for the monk. And then, as monk, how can we take the Buddhist knowledge to engage society? And also, society, how should they learn Buddhist knowledge? We need to get happiness in society. How is your opinion?
I think monks are doing a very good job. If you look at monks that have gone abroad, they've got a very big following. Many Westerners regularly visit their monk. So they're achieving a lot. I think probably you're referring to in the world or in Myanmar. In Myanmar it's established. There's no problem. Is that right? But Parahita here is very successful. This university is very successful. It couldn't have been established during Newinke, Masalake. They couldn't build this because you didn't have membership. You couldn't have membership more than 5 people together. But now, of course, you are able to set up an educational institute. You're able to set up schools, and like schools like Paundo'u and Kantakong, Ponjichao, they help a lot of the poor villagers who can otherwise get no education. It's very impressive. Very impressive, because the monks don't need a salary necessarily. They may want one, but they don't need it. So they can do an educational system that's very good value for lay people. So the impact that they have now, I think, is greater possibly even than earlier, because you have more places where you can teach and engage the laity on Buddhism. So, but I don't have an easy recipe. Maybe set up a website, a Facebook page on a particular topic that you feel strongly about, like, for example, anthropology, Buddhist anthropology. Set up a site and then engage. And then you'll find that worldwide people will engage you and ask you questions, and you can engage. Just set up a page or a web page or something like that. That creates a kernel of a beginning of an engagement with people who and you don't have to fly all the way to New York. You don't have to displace yourself. People will ask you questions from abroad. So it's a good beginning, and then you can make it, you can extend your connections and then build a network on Buddhism. I think monks are very good at it in Burma.
You have Loki Mingla Senapa. You have Loki Mingla Senapa. But in Shan, there's one ceremony before when we want child to, just before we ordain, the day we ordain, we have in Shan we call that Ablen or Tonen. If we're going to get ordination, not novice tomorrow, today our parents may prepare some what we call holy water, which they put some gold and things into that water and they bathe their child before just ordination. Is there any such thing, such mengla before they get ordination among the Loki Mengla Senapa? Is there the same action? And it's one question. And the second is that, is there any benefits for the spiritual development or for the good relationship, social harmonies from the such Loki Mengla and such Taunggyi boys? Do they have good benefits for the social harmonies? 2 questions.
Okay, so 2 questions. So 2 questions. One is that in Shan State you have Shan Buddhists who, before they do their Shimbyu, they do something with their parents, with some ritual, and which probably is Ananda Ngaba Puzo Buela Belukolera.
They bathing with some special water.
Yeah.
In that water they put on the pot, and then they put some gold and such thing.
But you don't put the water over anybody's head. It's
yeah,
not.
Even with child.
Oh, you do.
Ordained.
Oh, you put it over the child, the water. Oh, so that's bathing. That's abhisheka. So you're doing.
Maybe you call it Kansei Mingla.
What would you call it?
Kansei Mingla is washing the hand.
Oh, Gansei Mingla. Yes, of course. You also have that's part of the Loki Mingla as well. Gaon Yeta. But this is before the Shimbyu.
Before you
Yeah.
ordained.
So normally, if you enter in the Burmese case, it's after the Bede Mingala that you Gaon Yeta. And then you Tingan down there, and then you become a
But
novice.
you know, one of my relatives, they went to go to tent and they saved some money, and she said that I need to save some money to buy gold when my children gets ordained. Otherwise, I don't have any gold to get.
Yeah. To put in the bowl.
Yeah.
Interesting, very interesting. It's very interesting because that kind of sounds. I thought that the Shan Buddhists didn't do Bede, or at least Bede Mingala. But now you're saying that this is a form of Bede, the night before, the day before. I didn't know about that, but it involved gold. That's interesting. Yeah. So now your question is about benefits of Bede. Loki Mingala. Yeah, well, the Bede that they do in Myanmar is like a 3-hour event. And it involves a Bedesya, who is usually, he pretends to be a Brahmin, so he uses Brahmanic ritual. So, so he gets a Brahmanic ordination, symbolically. And then he has the kayu, the shell, and then he puts and then he puts it over the novices and the airboring candidates. And then it lasts about 3 hours, including music. There's a band, a saiwai, and it's like a very joyous occasion. Not in the past, it didn't used to always be. Like some would cry in the past, but now it's all very joyous. So that's a benefit. To some extent, it's a benefit because the whole village comes together and they strengthen their social ties and they have a good time and everybody helps cooking and they all have their own projects that they have to do in order to make it happen. So it's it strengthens the social ties. Yes, I would say so. But it's maybe more collective than in the Shan case because what I understand is that it's just the parents and the child with the bowl. And the gold.
Also on this day, because most villages, when they get some ordination ceremony, there will be around sometimes, as in my case, we have 44 childs get ordained on the same day.
At the same time.
So each home, and they will have such thing, and they will invite each other as well to come to their homes. My parents.
I mean, it still sounds a little bit different from the Mendeley case, where the Bede is a real ceremony, like it's a real event involving a lot of people, the whole village in principle.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Just another question about this. Did you say that there aren't any rites of passage? I don't understand that because
the right
go in as young boys, they may become under ordination, they may have other stuff. Does that not count as rites of passage?
The rites of passage aren't taken care of by monks. So there are rites of passage, but they're not taken charge of by the monks. The monks do not perform the ceremonial, the rituals. So it's another person who does the ritual. So my argument was that monks do not concern themselves with life cycle ceremonies in principle. Although the Shimbyu could be counted as a life cycle ceremony that is Buddhist, if you look at it and analyze it, the public part of that ceremony is Bede. It's the Bedesya, and that's the public side. When they are actually ordained as a novice, it's more or less a private affair, just family standing by with the monk, and then shaving the head and then taking the robe. So it's not a public event. So insofar as it's a public ritual, It is not a Buddhist, specifically Buddhist ritual, even though the honorary Brahmin makes it into a Buddhist ritual. But it's effectively a Brahmin ritual because historically the Buddha did not encourage monks to do these ceremonies because they involve worldly things. There are lovely girls, beautifully dressed, you're singing, music. It's no good for monks. So the idea is that monks shouldn't get involved. So my argument was that Buddhism is unusual because in Christian church, everything happens in the church from birth, ritual to death by the same pastor, the same father, in the same place. So you are sacralized. Marriage is sacralized. Puberty is sacralized. Reproductive rights are sacralized. In Buddhism, you cannot sacralize reproductive rights. It's impossible. So this is what's a huge difference between the two religions. And that was the point that I was making, really.
Can I ask one more question?
That's how
I made, no, I don't. Because now about the Myanmar people saying, oh, don't go to the Taunggyi or something, you don't pay respect to the Nat, but they obviously they do in their home. So what's the reason? How do you think?
In Christianity, in the West, with the Creator God, there's only one who has all the power. That's God. Now, if you see all these spirits, they don't exist. They're not worth it. And if anybody comes up and says, I want to go and do Taunggyi, I want to have a Taunggyi, they say, okay. In the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, all the witches were burned. You do not have those economy in England. So what you have is, within monotheism, you have a very, the church is very hierarchical. If, you see here, monks can say a little bit what they want. It's okay. But if in the Christian church you do it, top man says, this one is out. You have a strict hierarchy. They control the voice of the church. Church says this is the point of the church, this is the position, don't say anything else or you're out. So you have no possibility. Here you got 500,000 monks, all of whom can say a little bit what they like. And then the news goes to the ones who are the most extreme. And they say, yeah, we want to hear from you. And then it becomes news and then we're in trouble. So now, your question is Taunggyi necessary? Why? What is in it that makes it necessary for people to go there? Well, one thing is, you know that most of the Nagador are Memasha. Now, I'm not saying, this is worldwide. It's worldwide, the situation that gender and spirit cults have a very interesting relationship, not just in Myanmar, but it's the case in many other countries. Which is that to be entered by a spirit, you have to have a certain kind of mind. Now in Myanmar you say, Seinure. Yeah. So if you are Seinure, then the spirit can come in. But if it's Seimare, Ubama Ponji Pienye, Toro Kede, Mare, Mawinainu. So because you have Thinga, and it's like very hard for a nut to be able to deal with a monk, right? So there is a difference in which you can get possessed, okay? Now, why do people go there? Well, if I, as a student, I'm worried about my exams, and I say to you, Shimpia, Aumine, Samipa Aumine, Tamin Bahama Matthew. Siaro Biome, Sache, Dabime, Nepia, Aumine, Nepia. Samipa Nepia, a Chemishiro, Sachem, Chelumiaro. So, of course, you can go to your Seah and say, can I have the questions and the answers, which people do in Myanmar. But let's say you can't, the Seado says, no, I can't give you any support. You should have, William Shilu, Ma'aumimu. Okay, then you go to the Nat and you say, you say, oh, please, if I pass my exams, I will come here every year. And I will come and give you bananas and whiskey every year. And then, oh, yeah, you passed. What? It's a miracle. It's the nut. It's my nut. I've got my Sayadaw. My Sayadaw I go to a year ahead. And I say, look, I would like to pass my exams in 1 year. Or in my next life, I would like to pass my exam. Sayadaw era kang lo nai ne. Kudo ne yare, with kudo you can get there. But with na, they give you instant gratification. They give you, but you have to be frightened of them. Because if you say you come every year, you have to go every year. Otherwise, you're in trouble because the nag comes and then maybe possesses you and then you become a nagado. Then you have to marry the nag. It's very dangerous. So, but in Myanmar, what is so interesting is that all these nag and Weza and Bodo, Loki you know, we have our own concerns. We don't worry about them. But in monotheistic settings, it's not tolerated because you govern the laity along with all their ways, including their lifespan. Everything you govern God. So therefore, you say no nut. And if there's no nut, then no nut. There can be no nut. So therefore, in the West, people have nowhere to go. So they come to Taunggyi. They come to Myanmar. They say, So Siale, you will be very successful in the West because there are no nuts.
I would like to challenge that just a little.
Good.
In Christianity, there are lots of saints. And in my grandmother's time, you didn't go to a nat, but you went to a saint. And so my grandmother, if she lost something, she would make an offering to the saint who finds things. If she went on pilgrimage to Spain or to Portugal or where there are, she would make an offering to Saint Anthony, who is the patron saint of travelers. So this idea that none of this exists is not true, or not in my experience, because saints take the place of nat. Okay, so I personally don't make offerings, but near my house in London, there is a statue of St. Francis. Have you all heard of St. Francis? And every day, particularly Filipino, but also Catholic, mostly old ladies, they leave in front of the statue of St. Francis flowers and food. And I have shown my students that during the course, week 1 or week 2, to say that we may not have nat, but we have saints. And I think that's something that I would like you to comment on.
I can assure you that saints are no nuts. Nuts are pretty fearful. I mean, they're very frightening.
There are also saints who can be frightening as well.
Yeah.
In the old days, I'm not talking about now. I don't believe in it, but I'm saying that there is a case for talking about including saints as some sort of parallel. Not totally.
But of course, we're talking about the Catholic Church specifically, because generally in the Protestant churches we don't really go for saints too much. But in the Catholic Church, of course, these are part of a canon, of a hierarchy of persons who have been accepted within the church. As so, the Pope says, tomorrow, let's see, this one is holy, and this one is not. Let's put this one in the holy pantheon, and then the Pope puts them in. But in this case, there are no Sayadaw who puts the na in the Taunggyi kuname. It's Anarata, the king, who does it, and so they're not really within the same. Although they will say that if you give to a na, it's meritorious. They say kudo yare. The Nagado will say, fluye in kudo yare. Daarmee Taunggyi lao do me yao. So there is a difference between na and saints in that respect, that they are not really part of the.
Can I have one more question? I've been teaching Buddhist psychology here, and I have learned that in all culture, most women are more religious than men. What do you think, I mean, from the anthropology point of view? Can you share with us?
Well, whenever I went to a Vipassana center, it was 90% women and 10% men. And whenever I go to see
not only in Buddhist culture, even in Christianity and
Yes.
Islam also.
Yes, yeah.
Even a counseling center.
Yes, I think that's true. And there is an element of men having a sort of a psychology which is a little bit more autonomous. It depends on the culture, obviously, because every culture has its own gender models that you aspire to. If you go to the Mediterranean, you've got honor and shame, meaning that if something happens to your family, like your sister got a boyfriend and you don't approve of it, you go in there and say no. But in Northern Europe, you wouldn't do that. Your sister's business is her business. It's not my business. So you have all these different cultural patterns of who is part of my group, who should I defend, and at what point should I use violence even, or intimidation, and so forth. So all those things are there. So men tend to be an agent of sort of herding mentality or household. You know, there's a certain mentality among men, and that has largely to do with testosterone, I imagine. Testosterone, male hormone. You know, there's an element of aggression. When you have testosterone in your body, women don't have that much testosterone, mostly. There are some who have. So testosterone does make you more of an autonomous, aggressive sort of like personality. And maybe that accounts for something. But, you know, there are many reasons why one might think it's the case. But I agree with you that this is too. If you go to France and you go to the church there, it's mostly women. Even in churches in England, I think there are more women are concerned with it than men. Yeah, that's true. But here, of course, it's mostly men who become Taunggyi. So there's something going right here. What do you think? But nowadays in Thailand, some females are becoming monks.
But monks actually has a gender-specific role, right? I mean,
yeah.
Monks suppose is a masculine.
Yes. Yes.
I have a last question. Like, when you are talking about anthropologies, you're talking about more like a behavioral science, talking about how the behaviors can affect the cultures, practices, and vice versa. Right? So I wanted to know, whenever you are going to a alien place to look at their cultural practice, and then we all know, and all cultural practices, they have elements of religions in it. Do you see them as a combined trait, or you separate them? And if you separate them, how are you going to know? Because they are all the time intertwined with each other. How are you going to make a very just observation or perception of that? Thank you.
Are you an anthropologist?
I'm a scientist. I was trained.
I would have said you were an anthropologist. Yeah, so your question is, at what point can we call a religion? So we've got all these different practices to do with the sacred and so forth. Now, in anthropology, we have a problem with the term religion, because the term religion is only a fairly late term, and so we have language change, and because we perceive the world in a particular way, now we say we have world religions, and so that's okay, that's the way we live, and then there are these other things going on underneath it, like Taunggyi, but also animism or ancestor worship of the Chinese, for example, or all these other shamanism. So there are all these other activities. So anthropologists have dealt with that maybe by having a much larger array of activities that are considered religious. Because if you're, for example, Christian, you will deny the religious value of something if it doesn't fulfill your perspective, your particular perspective of religion. But as anthropologists, you have to accept that every people have their own ideals of sacredness and what is valuable and so forth. So you have to be open to the possibility that some things are a religion that your community may say, no, that's not a religion. That's idolatry, it's heathenism, it's wrong, etc., etc. So this is a very difficult thing, because once we begin with classifying things as religion, then we can't get out of it. We are like in a confined area. We've imprisoned ourselves in a particular. So I have actually written an article called Theravada, how a missionary invented the Burmese word for Buddhism, and the idea was there that Burmese would generally talk about Tadana, but then you wouldn't, in Bodhidharma, but you wouldn't have Bodhavada. That only came in quite late in maybe the 1890s, 1880s, or something like that. And it came in under the influence of competing religions who all wanted a claim within this system. So Burmese Buddhists had to accept that there was another category of Buddhism, of experience which related to laity, and they had their own concept of Buddhism, Miopala Bodhavada. So what I do is what is Buddhism, but that's different from the monks. So that Bodhavada concept then was supposedly introduced by a missionary in order to make all religions equivalent. So now Burmese are stuck with Bada as a universal religion, as a universal, among which are all these others at the same level as itself. There's nothing wrong with that. You do that with telephone numbers as well. If you only had your local telephone number but not an international, 00, then you could never call somebody else. So it is good to have Bada, probably, and you can put everything under it. But the problem really is we are categorizing different phenomena very readily as religion, and then we don't really know why we do it, because it's such a high-level term that we have trouble with it. And there are some philosophers who say that religion is a misused term. It shouldn't really exist. It's not adequate for the purpose, and it confuses things rather than helps things.
The nut in Shan State, I think the Taunggyi Kundamin, does this come with the Gomyokshin? Yes, one of them. Because in Shan State, when you go around, say driving a car, so there will be a big tree. Under that we have the center of nut. So at least people should, press the horn to play with that. What happened is that if you didn't do that, then because, for example, on the way to go to the Myanmar, so the accidents happen from time to time. So in this case, no matter when you are not near at the nut center, maybe you don't trust, you don't have the belief in the nut center. But everyone you go past, if you didn't press the horn, then you feel that you absent the duties, and also the people have this kind of belief strongly through the Shan State. So in the anthropology point of view, what do you think? This is the first question. The next one is in Thailand and Myanmar, the big different thing is Thai people, they strongly believe in emulating Buddha. But in Burma, as far as we know, we don't have this. Okay, this is the second question.
This idea of hooting when you pass by the spirit, or at least acknowledging the spirit, acknowledging that it's there. Of course, you do that all the time. When you yezechare, you distribute metta across all the thorns at the bone, and you make sure everybody's happy. And Mingala, though, if you don't recite it, then maybe there will be a very stinky spirit on top of the tree somewhere. So this idea of spirits is kind of there. Now, as to why you would do that, I suppose this is the original explanation of magic. Magic is, the idea that we had for magic was that it was a pre-scientific thing, and that you had no control of the environment by ordinary means. So you couldn't control an accident, because an accident is an accident. You drive a car, the car has safety features, but not safe enough to always get you from A to B without an accident. So you've got all science and all technology at your fingertips, but even a Tesla crashes. You know Tesla? A Tesla is these cars that are made in America, new electric cars, and they drive themselves, but even they crash. So they probably need their spirits in order for this not to happen. But okay, so there's this issue of magic and whether you can, by performing a certain ritual action, whether you can prevent this from happening. I think in most societies that's accepted, that you need some kind of alternative way of dealing with these things. But yeah, your second question about Thailand, the amulets. Yeah, it's true that do not believe this. Yeah, Taunggyi is an anthropologist who wrote a whole book about the amulets, and it's quite an interesting book. And one side of the amulet may have the king's image, and the other one has a very famous monk image. And this idea that they provide you with safety. I think in Myanmar maybe people have their own siador, and they feel that keeping a little image of the siador or some rosary or something that links to the siador sometimes gives them that feeling. Like with Taunggyi siador, I knew a lot of taxi drivers had a picture of Taunggyi siador in their taxi cab, not to have an accident. So it's very common. But I want to say one more thing, which is, if you don't have a creator God, a creator God is very simple. You only have one station. It's like a supermarket, a big supermarket. You can get everything in one station. But you don't have a big supermarket. You have, there is no creator God. So you have got to go to this siador, maybe this siador, maybe Taunggyi, maybe only na Sweme, maybe, yeah. So this idea that you're uncertain in Myanmar because you don't have this one-stop shop. You cannot solve all your problems. And this is why I think Mingala is such an interesting concept, also auspiciousness. Because Mingala Pyure, Mingala Bagamia, Mingala Pue, Shimbu Pue, Mingala Sao, Mingala, Loki Mingala, Senaba. This idea of Mingala is this search for auspiciousness, where there's no inauspiciousness that can come in. So if we are now in a very auspicious room because we have many siado in this room, that's why it's auspicious. And every Burmese recognizes that. But sometimes you cannot bring all your monks with you when you go to a place. So you need something. So this idea of Mingala is a search. The Burmese are continuously searching for Mingala, and they often don't find it because life is complicated. We grow old, we die, and we have problems. We don't pass our exams, so we need Mingala. Bega yamale, Taunggyi dwame. So this issue of Mingala, I think, has been under-described in Burmese society, and I think that's really worth doing.
Thank you.
Can I just make one comment about that? That's described by bankers, and when they're talking about everything, is managing risk and immeasurable uncertainty. Okay, that's whatever your religion, whatever God you follow, whatever system you follow, you are managing risk and immeasurable uncertainty.
I think that can be summarized in Nahi Verena Verani Samanti Ida Gudachana in the Dhammapada, that violence is never cured with violence. I think that's a good note to end this conversation. So we all thank you, Professor Houtman, so much for being here. It's an honor and a privilege for us, and we hope to see you next time. Thank you very much.